Alcor is pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar. Alcor is a global cloud advisory and implementation services company serving Fortune 500, government agencies, and other leading organizations in multiple industry verticals across the Americas, Canada, and India. Alcor is also a ServiceNow Gold Services and Gold Sales Partner. We partner with leading technology companies, including AWS, FireEye, Microsoft, Okta, Incorda, and BigPanda. We advise leading businesses on cloud platforms, architecture, enterprise service management, and integrating IT service delivery. We also provide business process consulting to capture, re-engineer, and improve processes that can easily be automated to deliver real value. The Alcor consulting team has excellence in business strategy, cloud technology, and organizational change management. Our ongoing webinar series is designed to inform, enlighten, and start discussions within your own organizations. If you require any additional information after listening to today's webinar, please reach out to us through our website, www.alcortech.com. We have time reserved at the end of the webinar for Q&A, so please feel free to type any questions into the questions section of the dashboard. Today's webinar topic is ServiceNow Integration with Tenable, Journey to the Center of the CMDB, Part 2, presented by Aleks Dmitrovic. Aleks is Alcor's Senior Vice President of Alcor Canada and is a results-focused strategic consultant and organizational leader with 20 years of experience, focused on driving strategic advisory, solution design, transformation, and operational excellence for customers and clients. Aleks is a certified ITIL v3 expert, Microsoft certified systems engineer, and Cisco certified network administrator. Aleks, take it away, sir.
Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everybody to the second installment in the ongoing journey to the center of the CMDB. There was so much to talk about around the CMDB that we decided to continue this journey, and hopefully we'll have a few more after this with varying degrees of conversation. Today we're going to look at the CMDB, vulnerability scanning, and Tenable specifically, and the value of having integrations like Tenable into your ServiceNow instance to do a number of things, as we'll see shortly. Just to remind folks, we are a top 5 ServiceNow partner in the United States and Canada. We also partner with a number of technology manufacturers, as Jeff mentioned, including we're partnering with Tenable, with FireEye, CrowdStrike from a security perspective, AWS, Microsoft Cloud, Google Cloud, among many. So definitely working on a lot of different technologies these days. We've got a tremendous breadth of experience with some fantastic customers, and have consistently scored high on the customer satisfaction scoring done through ServiceNow and our partner technologies to ensure that we're delivering the best value in the name of these manufacturers. This is a list of just a sample of some of the wonderful customers that we worked with to date. Many of these continue to work with us on their CMDB journey, their service asset management journey, and we are happy to do so with these great customers. ServiceNow is part of a very strategic portion of our cloud architecture. Alcor's enabling cloud looks to leverage best-of-breed cloud technologies in the service of work across the enterprise. As you will see today, integration into and out of ServiceNow is a standard conversation that we have, which allows folks in IT and outside of IT to leverage fundamental technology and operational data that they might not have access to otherwise. So what we tried to show today in the webinar is number one, how can Tenable help you validate the completeness of your CMDB, and what does that have to do with the CMDB at all? How can ServiceNow help enrich some of the Tenable information that your security teams have to work with? And how do you respond and prioritize vulnerability response across the enterprise with the goal of automating as much of that as possible? So where we left off in the last conversation was populating your CMDB, and we asked the question, do we have enough data? And the answer is there's a number of sources of data for your CMDB, and the CMDB is an ideal place to integrate, to federate data, because it starts to bridge the gap between technology folks, business folks, and folks outside of who either generate data, use data, or process data. We're seeing within the ServiceNow ecosystem a number of integrations as it relates to security, and all of these, including the Tenable integration, offer some insights into your CMDB. The value of the information is quite valuable, as you'll see. And so we continue to look at all the various sources of data that ongoing populate, update, correlate, validate the information in your CMDB to be able to really drive those key metrics: the completeness, the accuracy, and the breadth and the scope from a service perspective. So I'll start off with Tenable is a enterprise vulnerability scanning manufacturer. They have a number of products, but the two principal products are Tenable IO and Tenable Security Center. Fantastic products. We're happy to be partnering with Tenable. And what Tenable does is it scans all of your endpoints, the same endpoints that you would have in the CMDB. And it's looking for configuration and structure of those endpoints, and aligning those against vulnerability database, both publicly available and the plugins that Tenable continues to publish. And they have a ton of information as it relates to software, hardware, the different configurations that could potentially impact your environment. So, the question is, well, so what? What does that have to do with anything? A majority of customers out there, majority of organizations out there operate really a couple 100 miles behind where they need to be as it relates to patching and keeping their information and their systems up to date. Vulnerability scanning allows us to take a look at where we are within the context of the known vulnerabilities out there, and to help us to proactively resolve some of those issues prior to threats coming in and becoming major issues. There's a lot of information out there as it relates to vulnerabilities, and a lot of vulnerabilities are existing vulnerabilities that are published by manufacturers, published by government agencies, and by customer communities as well. And we centralize that information. We have a lot of access to that information. But the challenge with a lot of solutions and a lot of this information is that there's no centralized way to not only detect these vulnerabilities, but to remediate them in an effective fashion. And so what happens is we typically lack the ability to look at vulnerability information in alignment with our CMDB to understand the impact to things upstream and downstream. It's very difficult to understand who owns the remediation of those vulnerabilities, and it's even more difficult to determine how long that remediation is taking. And some of the numbers that are coming out from industry research are that vulnerability response typically is in the hundreds of days, which is fairly risky in the context of the things that are happening in the world today. So as a result, without a substantial ability to have full end-to-end vulnerability management, we can't have positive remediation without understanding the business impact, without aligning to formal change management, without having the ability to process security incident response through the context of standardized responses, and we definitely don't have the ability to respond to those vulnerabilities and ultimately threats in an automated way. So the other challenge that we have out there, and I think we all know this, is there's a massive skills gap and skills availability in security and in IT in general. The majority of cyber attack victims say their breaches could have been prevented if they had a more comprehensive patching capability. And many of them knew that they had vulnerabilities, but weren't able to take care of them in time. Organizations that had effective vulnerability scanning capabilities and the ability to automate some of the patching of those vulnerabilities were a lot less vulnerable to being breached and had better response to some of those issues as they happened. The big challenge for us, again, is staffing. Organizations are spending 320 hours a week on average, equivalent of about 8 full-time employees managing vulnerability response. It's a massive undertaking. Unless we have the ability to automate and expand that conversation across the organization, we're not going to be able to find enough folks to be able to process that level of information. We continue to increase our risk from these vulnerabilities. So where does ServiceNow and Tenable specifically fit into the context of vulnerability response and security operations? ServiceNow is a cloud provider, enterprise system of work. It has a number of integrations, everything from detection to SIMs, threat intelligence, vulnerability tools. And it's able to process that information, reference the CMDB and all of the service level information that's provided in that CMDB, and give us the opportunity to not only establish the manual run books as far as response from a governance perspective, but also to be able to automate some of that through the use of both workflows within the system and orchestration, leveraging common platform tools like Amazon, VMware, Azure, etc. So we're seeing more and more integrations into and out of ServiceNow, with the ultimate goal of processing more information, validating that information is up to date within the context of our CMDB, and allowing us to react and to proactively manage these issues prior to them becoming major threats within our environments. So let's take a look at the ServiceNow and Tenable integration. Security Center is typically an on-premise installation. Tenable IO is in the cloud. We have 2 ways of connecting to it. One of them is through a REST API to the cloud environment. The other one is through web services through a mid server into your environment. And as a result, what we're able to do is create a connection between Tenable and ServiceNow via the mid server. Mid server is, for the folks that don't know, is a Java applet that runs within your environment, but outside your firewall. It's the only thing that's allowed to talk to your environment through a firewall rule. And as such, we start to process and collect Tenable plugin data. Tenable plugin data is similar data to the common vulnerability feeds from NIST and from CWE and CVE. And together, we're able to put together a comprehensive list of a majority of the vulnerabilities that are known out there. There are some other tools out there that also provide some zero-day type of information. But all those combined come in and give us some context as far as what we're dealing with, the impact and the risk of those vulnerabilities, and the suggested remediation of those, which is typically patching. When Tenable goes out and scans your environment, there is a an agent installed on all your endpoints. This information comes through into ServiceNow and identifies a vulnerable item, which is matched to a CI in your CMDB. And it links to either a plugin that Tenable has or the information from NIST, CV, CWE, and creates a vulnerable item linked to that CI in the CMDB. It allows you to process that information and group that information to ultimately be able to respond to that. By integrating with Tenable, you have bidirectional integration in the sense that you can ask Tenable to go and rescan something if you want to validate the vulnerability. You can ask Tenable to rescan a number of things within the context of a change to validate that the patching has been completed and that the remediation is complete as far as the vulnerability. And it allows us to really track and perform better as far as SLAs, and to be able to automate some of the activities and standardize some of those activities in alignment with a number of the governance frameworks that are out there, SOC 2, NIST, ISO 27001 among a few. So together, Tenable and ServiceNow have put together a strategic partnership. They understand the value that each brings to the table. Tenable and ServiceNow offer best-in-class security, powerful vulnerability assessment, and quick response. It also gives the opportunity to bridge the gap between teams that typically don't work together, and frankly, teams across the organization, in determining the impact and the plan for remediation of some of these vulnerabilities to ensure consistent risk management and risk remediation. So we've looked at how we connect to Tenable and start to pull in some information. How do we align that to the CMDB, and what's the real value there? So when we look at our CMDB, not only are we collecting information about endpoints, configuration items, assets, whatever you want to call them, but we're looking at how they relate to each other, what the business impact is of any one of those pieces of the business service map in this case, if they were to be down, and understanding not only vulnerability information, event management information, incident problem change information, outage information, to give us a full picture of what's happening across our ecosystem, and to ensure that we've got consistent understanding of, from a services perspective, what the impact of some of those vulnerabilities are. So in this case, if the AIX server has a vulnerability that could potentially be a threat, could breach that server, it has direct correlation up to SAP Enterprise Services, which has financial ties, PII information. And so we're able to determine the impact and the criticality of managing that vulnerability. And in addition, as a side note, we're able to see and enrich that data and to determine whether our CMDB has some of these endpoints that Tenable has. And in 99% of the organizations that we work with, Tenable and a lot of these other sources of data, whether it's AirWatch, whether it's SCCM, they will have some data that you don't have currently in your CMDB. It could be something that was not plugged in when you scanned, was reintroduced into the environment, remote workers logging into the system. But we see a tremendous value in not only validating the completeness and the information in the CMDB, but also finding CIs that are not in the CMDB and giving us the ability to automate the creation of those CIs from the Tenable scan and to update our CMDB as required. In addition, the Tenable has a tremendous risk management and risk calculation engine on its side. But when it comes into ServiceNow, we have the ability to additionally look at severity and criticality based on risk calculators in the system, and to determine what are the standard remediation processes associated to those kinds of business services, those kinds of technologies, and give us a tremendous amount of reporting capability to determine where we're at. And we'll see that shortly. We'll do a bit of a demo in ServiceNow shortly. So we've looked at the integration into ServiceNow and understand the value of enriching that information on both sides. We've looked at validating that our CMDB has the appropriate information, and as we validate and complete that part of the process, we now start to respond to and proactively remediate vulnerabilities in our environment, all the while updating CI information and validating that we're complete correct. The ServiceNow provides the ability to take that information from Tenable and to start to process it in a number of ways that aren't necessarily done within Tenable. The vulnerability response process in ServiceNow, which is really why there's a ton of value in doing this work in ServiceNow, in addition to having a ton of these great products out there and still leveraging those. Being able to automate, coordinate remediation across the organization in a place where everyone has access to all the same information. First step is really to integrate those vulnerability scanners, whether it's Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable. We like Tenable a lot. You integrate those and you start to automatically prioritize and group vulnerabilities. As you'll see and you'll probably know, vulnerabilities can add up pretty quickly. Vulnerable items add up pretty quickly. It's almost impossible to manually process that level of information without establishing some way to prioritize and group them, and then to be able to assign review and coordinate remediation of those vulnerabilities. One of the important steps here, in addition to being able to remediate, is to be able to defer vulnerability response. Whether you're going to be retiring an endpoint, or the business impact or the environment is low criticality, you have the opportunity to defer the remediation. And this allows us to have effective governance and control over the process, with some excellent reporting as far as that goes. And then we leverage some of the integrations that we talked about, as far as not only executing the patching and the vulnerability of the vulnerabilities, but confirming that the vulnerabilities have been in fact updated and resolved, and provide some reporting around that. So we look at the heart of the conversation again is the CMDB. The Tenable is going to go out and scan your environments. It's going to pull back data, vulnerability data related to those environments. And it's going to create a vulnerable item within ServiceNow aligned directly to a configuration item. If it can't find a configuration item, there's rules in place to create one. And we leverage CI matching rules to determine which CI we're dealing with. Typically, we're looking at IP address, MAC address, NetBIOS, DNS names, to be able to associate what we're finding through Tenable in your CMDB. Once we've collected the vulnerable items within ServiceNow, ServiceNow processes that information and groups them into logical groups. It could be processed by vulnerability. It could be processed by quite anything. Any business context you could provide, we group those vulnerabilities that way, and then gives us the opportunity to assign those vulnerabilities, the vulnerable groups, to our remediation teams to process the information and to determine what are the appropriate next steps. By leveraging ServiceNow, we are able to automate all of this so that It's not a manual process to initiate this. It's not a manual process to group these vulnerabilities, vulnerable items. It's not a manual process to start the process of investigation, and all the way along this, workflow-driven, runbook defined. We have the ability to execute the same way every time, and to be able to track both the progress and the success of this process end to end, all the while updating information related to your CMDB. As we start to process and investigate, we can decide to create a change request and to automate the process of getting this patched, whether it's manually patching or whether it's automated patching. Patching is the net result of a lot of this. We have systems that are a number of versions behind that have known vulnerabilities. Priority-wise can be determined, and the remediation can be automated and executed effectively. And as a result, you start to get good reporting around what's happening as far as your CMDB and your vulnerabilities. And you're able to go back to Tenable and rescan all of those vulnerable items, those endpoints that had those vulnerabilities, and to determine whether you've in fact remediated those vulnerabilities. And if it comes back that they have in fact been remediated, those vulnerable items, and vulnerable groups will be closed. So full end-to-end automation and execution of the vulnerability response. As I mentioned, grouping is an incredibly powerful function. There's hundreds and thousands and millions of vulnerable items that comes through. Any one endpoint can have 50 vulnerabilities depending on what's installed on it, what it's connected to, among other things. So we have the ability to group these manually. We have the ability to create conditions that are driven by either the structure of the CMDB from a service perspective, departments, type of endpoint, or we could create special rules to look for various criteria and to be able to group those things together. As a result, we see significant value in bulk remediation, bulk investigation, better impact analysis as far as what would happen if we don't, if we decide to defer. And it gives us the ability to process these things in a much faster and much more effective way. This is an example of a workflow within ServiceNow. If you look, it starts the process with a trigger. It will assign tasks to various folks within the organization. It will assign tasks to automated tasks, malware detection, endpoint tools, vulnerability scanning tools. It will determine whether there's sensitive data exposed, and it may start a parallel process to start to notify law enforcement, human resources, legal, etc. As a result, we have a standardized approach and a standardized response every single time that allows us to pass governance standards, pass audit standards, and to ensure that we're effectively managing these things every single time. Automated response orchestration, as I mentioned, installing patches, removing viruses, changing network configurations, rebuilding systems with some of these tools. The result of these automated workflows, automated response to vulnerabilities, threats, and security incidents within ServiceNow allow us to automate the remediation and ensure that it doesn't get left as an afterthought and is processed effectively to closure. There's a couple of security operations dashboards. I'll go in and I'll show you in greater detail in the system, but I just wanted to quickly summarize recommendations and sort of next steps for folks who are looking to leverage vulnerability scanning, Tenable specifically. If you're already a customer, if you're not, happy to talk to you about the opportunities to leverage Tenable. But the next steps for a lot of organizations, very specific, very key. Understand where you are as far as vulnerability response. Look at and determine whether you have any manual run books today. Do you have a standard set of operating procedures to be able to score risk, to be able to establish response, and to be able to introduce vulnerability patching process in the organization? I know it seems silly to think that we don't have, some organizations don't have this. The reality is that we don't, there's not enough hours in the day and not enough resources to effectively do this, and so a lot of this is an afterthought. So it's important to assess where we are and to go after really the low-hanging fruit. Prioritize our vulnerabilities by looking at data that we're referencing from tools like Tenable, from CWS, CVS, CVE, and determine what are the most important things to go after to protect, mitigate risk, manage risk within your organization. Another big area of approach here is to continue to break down the barriers between security and IT. And that barrier is very real for a couple of reasons. Security folks are working hard to analyze and protect everything within the environment. When they ask you to patch something, they're not doing it for their health. That's typically a tough conversation some days. And by leveraging a vulnerability program, we're able to start to really come together and work towards a common goal, which is identifying those vulnerabilities and providing a way to respond to them, and helping to define the right IT system owners for patching of those vulnerabilities. And then probably most important is to define that end-to-end response process and then automate as much as possible. And that automation can be as simple as sending out notifications, sending out tasks, establishing SLAs, but most importantly, having visibility into what's happening and having the ability to drill down and look at how that impacts your CMDB and the CIs within your CMDB. So we'll jump into ServiceNow and just take a look at some of that in action. As you can see here, I'm just going to expand this a little bit. Right now I'm logged into ServiceNow, and we're looking at the CISO dashboard. So at the highest level across the organization, I'm able to see how we're processing and reacting and remediating and automating response to vulnerabilities and threats within the organization. We have the ability to look at risk from a corporate perspective. We have the ability to look at risk from a business and a service perspective. All of this information is being processed in real time, and we're able to go in and look at information down to the very specific CIs and services that we're looking to respond to. This is, again, a high-level overview, and it's an opportunity to look at trends and patterns and to be able to drill down into some of the key things. So if I look at my P1 security incidents, I'm able to establish what's happening, who's assigned to it, and to understand the priority and the risk, and to look at the impact to other things within the organization. So if we look at this here, we have a P1 security incident open for this network gear. When I look at what that's connected to across that line of business or that service, I'm also able to determine what other things are happening out there. So I see there's changes currently in place for network interfaces. We may actually be in the process of remediating some of this. We have incidents and problems open across this spectrum, and we have security incidents and vulnerable items that we're able to look at all within the context of the CMDB and to determine the impact and the priority and some real good context as it relates to what that P1 security incident means to us. From a vulnerability perspective, we're able to look at how well are we responding to the tremendous amount of data that's coming through. As noted, through an integration with a tool like Tenable, you're going to start to get a lot of data as it relates to items that have known vulnerabilities and that need to be remediated pretty quickly, depending on what they're connected to and what information they possess. And so what I have here is a vulnerability explorer. And again, I'm looking at most prolific vulnerability IDs. I can start to sort by priority. I can look at vulnerability age. I can look at vulnerability by department criticality, among other things. I can look at remediation timelines and start to really assess how well we're doing as it relates to the battle of patching remediation within the environment. And as noted, vulnerable items and vulnerable groups are where we get the data coming in from various sources. It could come from CVE, it could come from Tenable, but as we scan, we start to look at information related to vulnerabilities in our environment. We can look at how they're grouped, and we can group them, as we mentioned, in a number of different ways, grouped by department, grouped by vulnerability. We can start to look at some of the information around what the vulnerability is and what the response to that would be. Integration on this one here is Qualys, but we for this conversation we're talking about Tenable. We're getting that data and enriching our information, and we're able to start investigations manually. We're able to look at, we can create change records automatically. And as we look at managing vulnerability groups, if you look at vulnerable items, you've got right now 6,800. That's really low. This is just demo data. In a lot of customer environments, we're into the hundreds of thousands. And so we're able to look at risk process, all that information. And if we determine that this is a critical vulnerability, we can initiate critical vulnerability workflow, standard response that is going to ensure that this is taken care of. The appropriate folks are contacted. We have change requests automatically getting kicked out. We have tasks going to a number of folks to ensure that this gets the visibility that it needs, and to ensure that the remediation and ultimately the update, the patching of that endpoint or CI happens, and that CI is as up to date as it needs to be to maintain and manage risk in your organization. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Jeff, are there any questions from our friends on the call today?
There are actually, Alex. I'll get to them just a moment here. As a reminder, please use the questions section to ask Alex a question on today's topic. So let's jump right in. So is this replacing any internal tools? So I'm assuming that means would Tenable replace any internal tools?
So two things really. I'm going to just show you quickly integrations. So ServiceNow, number one, is not meant to replace Tenable. It's not meant to replace Splunk. It's not meant to replace a number of integrations, a number of tools that you're using today. You're going to continue to use your security products. You're going to continue to use discovery. You'll continue to use SCCM to populate your CMDB, to scan your environments, to pull in data. ServiceNow is coordinating the remediation and the response based on those relationships. So they work very well together. In fact, I don't think they can work in isolation, either one of them, as effectively as they can together. And as such, you're not going to see a reduction in the amount of tools that you have in place. You're going to see a lot more value out of the tools that you currently own, and potentially see the need for added tools as well.
Okay, so this is maybe a little bit of a related question then. What do I do if I don't have Tenable?
That's fair. Well, the easy answer to that is we would be happy to have a meeting with you to discuss some more specifics around Tenable. I think it's important for you to start to, at a minimum, have some vulnerability scanning capability if you don't already have it. That's a key. Depending on the size of your organization, the size of your infrastructure, there's a number of different options as far as that goes. But it's important to start down that path. And if you're going to be doing your CMDB, you want to get some data from a vulnerability scanning tool like Tenable.
Okay. Here's one that I can actually answer. Will part 1 and part 2 recordings be available? I would like to show this to my management team. So the answer is yes. Part 1 is available on our website, www.alcortech.com. In the top menu, there's a link for webinars, and part 1 will be there with all of our other webinars. And this webinar as well will be loaded probably within the next day or two. So yes, the recordings are and will be available. How are vulnerabilities related to assets that eventually find their way to security incidents?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I mentioned, a couple of key things within that conversation. The CIs or the assets in your organization are the same CIs and assets you're going to be talking about outside of ServiceNow. There's two approaches to the vulnerability management. One of them is proactive. The other one is reactive. And a good example of that is you, through either a monitoring tool or through somebody simply opening up a request to say, I think there's an issue, I think there's a threat or a breach. And what we're able to do is to take that information to identify specifically which CI we're looking at. And by having integration with a tool like Tenable, you'll be able to understand the impact of that threat specifically, and to understand how to respond. So if we have a threat that's detected, for example, phishing is probably the easiest, most prolific one these days to talk about. If your system is completely patched and set up properly, a threat isn't necessarily an issue or an incident until it's able to leverage a vulnerability and become a problem, if you will. So as we start to open up incidents, we're going to associate them very specifically to CIs and in turn assets, and be able to look at and determine what vulnerabilities specifically do we have in place that we need to be aware of for this specific endpoint or system.
Okay. What is the difference between ServiceNow Discovery and Tenable Scanning in regards to the CMDB?
Yep, that's a great question too. So ServiceNow Discovery it gives you the ability to proactively go out and scan environments, IP ranges, network segments, and to be able to start to populate a CMDB. In addition, what it's starting to do is to establish relationships between various parts of your infrastructure to start to build out that business system map. It's a precursor to service mapping. And what that does is it builds that BSM map, which allows you to see upstream and downstream. What's connected to this? What's the business criticality? Who manages these things? All that stuff is populated in the CMDB. Whereas Tenable is going out and scanning all of your endpoints for a very specific function. It doesn't necessarily care, excuse me, what something is connected to. What it's very focused on doing is determining how is the configuration of that endpoint in alignment with the known vulnerabilities that are out there, and allowing you to have some insights into what those vulnerabilities are and how to prioritize and remediate those. So they're almost two sides of the same coin. One is gives you the ability to proactively start to look for things very specifically that are not security related. And Tenable is a lot more security focused, but as an outcome of that work, we're able to link that to the CMDB.
All right. Does this also integrate with Kenna, Kenna, which provides vulnerability analysis and prioritization?
So I'm not familiar with Kenna specifically, but we have the ability to integrate with ServiceNow in a number of different ways. Something as simple as an inbound email. We can parse that data, leverage CI matching rules, and update ServiceNow with that information. A majority, if not all, of modern technologies these days have a well-published REST API library. And so being able to call and do either a bidirectional integration with these systems will allow you to exchange data pretty frequently and pretty effectively.
Okay. All right. So if anyone has more questions around that, they can certainly contact you, contact Alcor, and we'll help them with that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see. What is the main security threat to be concerned about? Is it hardware, software, or something else?
Yeah, that's a great one. So it's a bit of all of the above, quite frankly. This year specifically, WannaCry was on top of everybody's mind. That was a flaw in the hardware of the chipset. We're seeing a lot of vulnerabilities come through the specific configuration of some of the hardware. With virtualization, we're seeing a lot of our technology moving into the cloud, and really we're talking about how software files are running on host, virtual and physical hosts. So it's a combination of all of those. But what we're seeing is a tremendous shift and movement in the community, both folks who work in security and in technology sharing information about things that have impacted them from a security perspective. The government, NIST, security manufacturers are publishing data and sharing that data around the world, all towards really the same net goal, which is to be able to help you understand the impact of the configuration of your hardware and your software, and to understand how that could be breached or impacted through any one of the threats that are out there these days. And new threats, as you know, popping up every day.
All right. my dog's seeing somebody walking down the path.
Oh.
What would be the biggest value that Alcor ServiceNow partnership can bring to both heterogeneous and heterogeneous on-prem and a cloud environment?
That's great. Great question. So the value of a company like ServiceNow, Alcor, is that we partner with best of breed manufacturers. I'll go back to sort of the diagram back here. And what that partnership means is a couple of real key things. Number one, it means that we're spending the time and the money to get our folks certified and trained to work with customers on day-to-day operational issues, both cloud, on-prem, combination of public cloud, private cloud, and so we see a lot of things that come from having those relationships with those manufacturers. We get support from them, we get training from them, and in turn we share that information with our customers. We've done hundreds of implementations, not just ServiceNow, with hundreds of customers, and so we continue to leverage the best things we learn along the way, so that our customers don't make the same mistakes that others have made.
Okay. All right. Last question. So if anyone's got any other questions, please make sure you type them into the question section. Have you seen other customers actually using vulnerability response to update their CMDBs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're working with a number of customers currently, and ServiceNow has a number of referenceable customers in this space. As I said, the opportunity here is to bridge a couple of gaps. One of them is that the amount of work involved in vulnerability response, without the appropriate mechanisms in place, is ridiculously difficult. Organizations are having to leverage these kinds of relationships, Tenable and ServiceNow, because they just can't find enough folks to be able to do some of this work. These manufacturers are partnering with each other. ServiceNow and Tenable have partnered, strategic partnership in place, and they preach the value of each other's presence in organizations. A lot of organizations have ServiceNow and are leveraging ServiceNow among the various platforms and tools that you see here on the screen. So they're building integrations constantly to each other, and really expanding the opportunities much more so than what we saw previously in on-prem legacy sort of implementations.
Okay. All right. Well, that's it for questions. Thanks, Aleks. The recording of today's webinar will be available on our website, www.alcortech.com. We'll also send everyone that's attending a link to the recording. We'll send that to everyone via email. All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And I guess we're into just about December, so we'll have another webinar early part of 2019. So all the best to everybody for the holiday season and a Happy New Year.
Thanks, everyone.